Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Troy Mares. I am pumped to have you here. Today, we review the Canon C70. I'll open up the review with a couple distinguishing factors as to why I think you would pick this camera over a lot of other brands out there, because the truth of the matter is you can create really incredible imagery with just about any brand of camera. So what are the reasons that you would go for the Canon C70 over anything else, in my opinion? So the first distinguishing factor, and probably the main reason this camera is on the table today, is because of the sensor. All right, it's got the Super 35 dual gain output sensor from the higher end C300 Mark III, which is an $11,000 camera, and they've repackaged it into this $5,500 body. I think the direct competitor to the C70 is Sony's FX6, and in that situation, they go the opposite direction, where they take the sensor from their smaller mirrorless, say the A7S III, and essentially repackage that into the larger form factor of the FX6. So from a sensor perspective, I think this is a great value proposition. As it relates to the DGO sensor, we're doing +2 on image quality. The next factor, and I know I said the first one was probably the most important, but this I think has equal weight, and that is the RF mount on the front of the camera. This is Canon's newest mount, and this has unlocked a whole new lineup of lenses, Canon's RF series lenses, that are nuts. So as I began to invest more heavily into a lens system, I wanted it to be the Canon RF, so the RF mount makes that possible. So as far as that equation goes, we're gonna give another point to image quality. The next distinguishing factor for the C70 is gonna be the recording modes. We have some great codecs to work with here, specifically XFAVC, that's what I use the most. In that XFAVC container, we can shoot in 4K up to 120 frames per second, but that is not all, because we can also shoot in Canon's RAW Lite internally to SD cards in 4K 60p. Let's go. +1 for image quality, +1 for image acquisition, because it's done internally. That is awesome. Points across the board. So our top 3 distinguishing factors were pretty exciting and pretty flashy. The next one is a little more subdued, but I do think it is a noteworthy distinguishing factor, and that is the ability to shoot in C-Log2. This is Canon putting its best foot forward as far as logarithmic curves go, and it is allowing that sensor to preserve as much detail as it possibly can, so that way you can take it into post and expand it, manipulate it, do whatever you need to do to get the best image possible out. And that's not something you get on all the different Canon cameras. So C-Log2, image quality, give it a point. And the last distinguishing factor of the C70 that none of my other cameras have had, that I cannot live without, is built-in internal NDs. So as far as the ND filters go, we're gonna give image acquisition the point first, because it does help incredibly in acquiring a great image, but we're also gonna give a point to image quality because the filters used in the camera are so good with no color shifting. All right, it's time to roll up our sleeves and take a physical tour around the camera. First thing worth noting is it does feel like a very dense package. It's actually surprisingly heavy, but in a good way, all right? I like having a little bit of extra weight, if nothing else, because it feels more professional. It does hold like a mirrorless camera. It feels kind of like a 1DX Mark II or III. I think it's okay. It's not like it's too big or too heavy to use that way. It's just not the way that I find myself shooting if I can avoid it. Let's begin our tour with the back of the camera, because that's what we as camera operators look at the most, is the back of the camera. First thing you'll notice is a flip out screen that can also swivel and tilt and pivot and do all the things that you want to do. There were some issues in early production models with the hinge of the monitor. I do believe that's been across the board addressed and fixed, and Canon is repairing them. If you have a hinge problem, you can send it in there and they'll repair it and send it back to you. I have not had an issue with mine. I got mine late enough in the run that I think they got that solved. So flip out screen is great. Flipping out that monitor exposes the external audio controls. These are great. You have 2 separate controls for channel 1 and channel 2 with gain knobs for each one respectively. You can set those to auto or manual. I usually have channel 2 set up as a safety track, recording about 10 to 12 decibels lower than channel 1. This is such a great addition that you don't find on a lot of other camera bodies, so much so we're gonna give image acquisition a point for external audio controls. Just below the external audio controls, you're gonna find your battery compartment. This is natively slotted for the BPA style battery. This has been great. If you're coming from an R5C or are familiar with the problems of the Canon R5C, you know that battery is a real issue and there's not a great workaround for it. No workaround needed here for the C70. There are also plenty of third-party manufacturers that make BPA-style batteries in larger capacities should you need them. When I do rig this camera out, I switch the BPA 30 for a BPA 60, one that has a D-tap out port. I'll actually put a link on the screen to a video I made explaining how I rigged this camera out. I'll also put the link in the description below. But the BPA 30, the one that comes with the camera, is great for keeping that compact form factor, as well as when I fly it on a gimbal, I rock the BPA 30. Just to the right of the battery compartment, you're gonna find a small DC in port. This is great if you want to use wall power for your camera without having to use some type of dummy battery solution. This is built in. Moving up from the DCI port on the right side of this camera, you're gonna find a button layout that is very reminiscent of a DSLR or mirrorless camera. Starting from the top, you got a couple of customizable buttons. I use those. If you want a video on how I customize all the different customizable buttons on the C70, drop a comment down below and I'll see what I can do to make that video for you. Coming up soon. So buttons 7 and 8 are up top there. To the right of those buttons are a joystick. You can go left, right, up, down, and also clicking in for a selector. Truthfully, I don't find myself using this very often, and we'll kind of touch on that later. Just below that is a scroll wheel, left and right scroll wheel. I would recommend disabling that. There is an option in the menu to disable it. Reason being is there's not much resistance to it. It flies pretty freely and it can be pretty easily bumped. So if you set, say, your ISO to that scroll wheel, it's very likely going to be changing on you unless your camera is sitting on a tripod and there's not much movement going on around the camera. Great, more power to you, but that's just not how my shoots go. So I disabled that and I don't ever use it. Just below the scroll wheel is customizable button 9. I use that one frequently and I've got that one mapped. Then the last interface on the back of the camera is the scroll wheel with the menu button above and the cancel button below. This is a great way to interact with your menus when you've got them pulled up. Let's move on. We'll go to the next important part of the camera, and that is the left side. The left side of the camera has a lot going on, so let's start from the top and work our way down. And the first thing that we're gonna come across are 2 mini XLR ports. This is incredible to find on such a compact body, and it opens up such a broad range of professional XLR microphones that we can easily run the audio signal directly into the camera. We're gonna give image acquisition a point because of how easy it is to run those lines into the camera, and we're gonna give image quality a point because of how good the preamps are and how good those mics sound running into the C70. Staying on the topic of audio, just below the XLR inputs is a 3.5mm audio input, and just below that is another 3.5mm audio out port. This is for monitoring your audio channels via headphones while they're being captured. Other ports you're going to find on the left side of this camera include a USB-C port. You're also going to find a remote port, and right below that is an HDMI out port. I'm going to have to subtract half a point to image acquisition for only having an HDMI port. This is a professional cinema camera, and I think HDMI is not stable or secure enough to operate at that professional level. I wish that there was an SDI port on this, so we do lose half a point for image acquisition. A couple more buttons that you're gonna find on the left side of the camera. Yes, there's a lot going on over there. On the top left of it, you're gonna find your ND filter adjustments, a plus and a minus. You can adjust ND filters in 2-stop increments all the way up to 10 stops. Below that, you're gonna find 2 more customizable buttons, buttons number 1 and 2. You're also gonna find on the left side of the camera 4 more customizable buttons, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All right. Because of all the customizable buttons on this camera, we're giving image acquisition another point because I map all of my buttons very meticulously and painstakingly when I first got the camera, and I use them so frequently that I really never have to go into my menu system. And the last thing worth noting on the left side of this camera is an air intake port. And the reason it has an air intake port is because it's got a built-in fan to keep this thing cool, which means it'll never overheat on you. +1 to image acquisition for not overheating. So we'll move to the front of the camera. First thing you're gonna come across is the RF mount, and you're gonna see that DGO Super 35 sensor within that mount, all right? Love both of those things. We already talked about those as the distinguishing factors. And then the last things worth noting on the front are custom buttons 11 and 12. Again, I have those mapped as well, but those are available on the front of the camera. So let's bring this to the right side. The right side of the camera is pretty bare. Not a whole lot going on here. And the reason being is as you hold this as it's intended, you wouldn't want to be accidentally hitting buttons with your palm. There are a couple things going on though that are worth mentioning. The first one being a quarter 20 mount directly in the center, which is an interesting thing to have built into the body. And the reason being, it allows you to attach a tripod plate directly to the camera, and now you can shoot vertical content. I didn't buy this because of that, but I tell you what, I use it more than I thought that I would have. Because of that quarter 20 mount on the side allowing us to shoot vertical content, we're gonna give image acquisition another point because we don't have to buy a cage or some weird L bracket to adapt it. They thought of it and built it into the camera itself. Another thing you're gonna find on the right side of this camera is the SD card slot, and I'm gonna open it just like so. It's got a door inside of it, 2 SD cards. I use 2 pro-grade 128 gig V90 cards in there pretty much at all times. That lets me record up to that RAW format like we mentioned in the distinguishing factors, all done via SD cards, and they're found right there. And on the right side of this camera, the last thing we're going to talk about is the timecode in port, kind of tucked away down here on the bottom. That is a BNC in port, and it allows us to sync via timecode this camera to other cameras that are on our production or to external audio sources. That is a great thing to have, a must-have for a professional camera. And because of that, we're gonna give image acquisition a point. So that does it for the right side of the camera. Came out pretty good, gave us 2 more points in image acquisition. Which brings us to the top of the camera. Kind of a lot going on here, so we're gonna methodically work our way across. First thing you're gonna find is a screw for focus pulling. This is right at the plane of the sensor, so you can attach a focus tape to it and get critical focus should you need that on your set. There's also a camera strap mount and a cold shoe port on the top with a quarter 20 inside of it, and that does come in handy for attaching cages and other things to the camera in a secure fashion. Moving from the cold shoe over to the right, as you see it on camera, is the on-off and lock switch. Moving on from the on-off switch, you're gonna find 2 buttons dedicated to media. The first one is labeled media, and this allows you to play back anything that you have recorded to the card. And then the button right below that is slot select. This lets you select card A or card B without having to dive into the menu to switch cards. From there, you're gonna find a left-right scroll wheel. This is a customizable wheel, so you can assign a number of functions to that wheel. You're also gonna find a big red record button because this is a video camera, and everybody needs to know that this is a video camera, so you have to have a big red record button. Honestly, I like the red button, so I don't mean to give it a hard time. But nestled next to that record button, you're gonna find custom function button 10. Again, another assignable button up here that you can map to a number of different functions. Which brings us to the bottom of the camera, the last part of the camera to talk about in our physical walk around tour. You're gonna notice a couple of different quarter 20 holes as well as 1/3/8 hole, okay? I do wanna point out the orientation of these holes, and you notice that they run horizontally as opposed to vertically in line with the camera. And that kind of sucks because that doesn't give you a useful option for mounting a tripod plate. Sure, you could mount with just one of those holes, but I don't think that's a professional way to mount a tripod plate because it's gonna spin over time, and that's just so frustrating. The only way to truly mount a tripod plate to the bottom of this is to put some type of adapter, some type of cheese plate, or buy a C70 specific tripod plate that utilizes these horizontal holes. I have one from Bright Tangerine that I got, which was fine, but I am gonna have to subtract half a point from image acquisition because of this less than normal mounting orientation on the bottom. And that will do it for the physical walk around of the C70. Let's dive into the menu system next. Let's go ahead and get this thing fired up. You'll notice right away that the boot up time is very fast. I like to see that. When we turn this camera on, we're greeted with a display that has all of the information that we would need to capture a successful image at a glance. I am gonna note, as I talk about the monitor as a whole, it just has okay brightness levels. I'll put the actual nit value on the screen here for you, but I have had some issues seeing this outside on a sunny day, so I can't recommend using this as a standalone unit in that environment. So because of that, I'm gonna subtract half a point from image acquisition. It is a touchscreen monitor, which is great, which means we can tap to focus. We can also tap into a quick menu system that allows us to adjust our exposure settings as well as our white balance. With a tap of a button, we can engage ND filters, we can change our aperture, our ISO, and our shutter angle very quickly. If you did need to dive into your menu system, you can press the menu button, and by default, it's gonna pull up the My Menu page, and you get 5 different pages of custom menus to put your most used features on that page. Because of how many customizable buttons that there are on this camera, I rarely have a need to dive into the menu, and I can accomplish everything I need to do without having to get into the menu system. The last couple things to mention as it relates to the monitor, and this being a cinema camera, are the exposure tools that we're given. We do have a waveform. I always have that up on my screen. That's just the way that I like to view my log exposure. There is also a false color option. I should probably use that more than I do. I just don't think about it because I'm not used to having it. None of my other cameras, except for the Red, had false color. Because I made this video and I said that, I'm gonna try to implement false color more into my workflow as well. We also have a vector scope. I don't use that very often. I don't think it's implemented very well into the C70 here, but I also don't find myself needing a vector scope the way that I shoot. The last thing worth noting on here is focus peaking. You can adjust the color and the intensity of that in the menu system. I do find myself using focus peaking quite a bit. All right, so that completes the monitor interface as well as our physical walk around of the camera. We went through the technical specifications and the physical features, all the things that you could learn from a sell sheet. The more important question is probably, what has been my experience with this camera out in the real world? It's worth knowing what my experience is. So I founded my own production company, Kairos Film Co. Just about everything Kairos shoots is in that commercial space. So I spend a lot of time on sets in different locations. As a business owner, or if you're a freelancer, one of the things that we're always trying to do is to network and grow our client list, the people that we get to work with, right? And you do that through first impressions, second impressions on sets. If you want them to hire you back, maybe you meet someone new on the set, or maybe they recommend you to somebody else. You're always trying to build a larger base of clients, right? And perception is a very real aspect of that first impression. I remember when I first got into this industry, I would take my small mirrorless camera and I would try to add as much stuff onto it as I could to make it look bigger so it looked like I knew what I was doing, and hopefully in the eyes of the client, they thought that I did because I had a big camera. Now, having a big camera in no way, shape, or form is what makes you a professional versus not. You can create incredible images with just about any camera that's out there today. But as far as perception goes, as it relates to the C70, when I come onto a set with this camera, a client feels like they got what they paid for. Then to take that idea of having a bigger camera is better and just flip it on its head, I'm always talking about how efficient and effective I can be with my gear. As I've grown in this industry, and courtesy of Matt Diavella, I've become a bit of a minimalist. So I'm trying to pare down the things that I take with me, and I want it to fit. Hopefully the day will come I can fit it all in a good sized backpack. So how does this camera fit into that mentality? Well, I think it straddles the line really well between perception and portability. When I strip this down, like so, this packs away really well into a backpack, and I can travel with it very easily. It's still small enough to be portable. It's still light enough to not be too taxing on the shoulders. So it's kind of a best of both worlds, right? We've got the good perception, but we also have good portability. All right, let's talk autofocus. This is kind of a big one that surrounds the C70. What is the autofocus performance like? I've used a lot of different cameras, like I said before. It's not quite as snappy and feisty as some of those smaller ones are, where it's kind of all over the place and hits the background and comes back quite a bit. This is a little bit slower. It takes its time. It just feels sound. It feels solid. And I've liked the autofocus performance on it, especially doing talking head type stuff. It has face only autofocus. What that does is it locks onto a face and it's not gonna focus on anything else. I've had a good experience with the autofocus of the C70, not one that I would even complain about. So that's that. From the autofocus, we're gonna talk about the sensor and the actual image that comes out of this. We're talking about dynamic range, we're talking about highlight roll off, and the actual image itself. I alluded earlier to the fact that the image that comes out of this feels very organic and natural, and it is a little bit softer than you're getting from some other cameras out there. Okay, it's not quite as contrasty, it's not as punchy, it's not as sharp, but those feel like all bad characteristics for the image, but it does it in a way that feels very organic and natural. It feels very filmic or cinematic, if you will. The dynamic range is off the charts. You're not gonna find dynamic range that is better than this camera at this price point. That DGO sensor dual gain output is how it achieves that incredible dynamic range and that incredible latitude. One pixel at any given time is recording two separate gain signals, okay? The first one is set really low and it's preserving details in your highlights. The second one is set much higher and it's preserving color information in your shadows. And the two of those come together into one pixel and gives you such an incredible latitude in your dynamic range. I think it's rated at 15 stops. I'm gonna put it on the screen here if I'm wrong, but I believe 15 stops is what we're getting out of the C70, and it's all thanks to that incredible DGO sensor. Real world experience battery life, I touched on earlier. Battery life has been great. Out of a BPA 30, I usually get about 2 hours. BPA 60, I'm usually running with a monitor, so it's not super fair comparison, but I can get 3 or 4 hours out of a BPA 60. Battery life has been great. Truthfully, at the outset of the C70 purchase, I was a little bit leery of only having SD cards, okay? There are better media storage options out there, but they're also more expensive. And Canon was able to get everything that I need this camera to do to work with an SD card, which means I can get high quality, high capacity SD cards that work in this camera for a fraction of the cost of CF Express Type A or B cards. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a win all the way around. So, thank you for making it to the end of this video. I know that was kind of long-winded. We talked about an equation at the beginning for determining how well a camera is balanced, right? Image quality, image acquisition. The scores are up on the screen for us to take a look at. It looks like it balances out pretty well. I ran this same equation on my Red Komodo. Image quality through the roof. Image acquisition tanked. That is a tough camera to shoot with, a lot of workarounds to make that what I needed it to be. So, to see this balance out for the C70 the way that it does, I think is great, and it bodes well for my future with the C70. I've been through a pretty painstaking and meticulous process of coming up with the perfect camera system, camera solution for my workflow, right? I've addressed points of friction as they come up along the way, and I'm not saying the Canon C70 doesn't have its own points of friction, but with a little bit of extra help, I'm able to get this camera to work seamlessly into my workflow. We're gonna take this conversation into the next video, the one that's on the screen now, to learn how, and more importantly, why I rig the C70 the way that I do. So go ahead and click on that. Thank you for making it to the end of this video on the Canon C70. I hope it helped. I really do appreciate you hanging out with me today. If you don't mind, go down below, hit the like, hit the subscribe, do all the things you're supposed to do on YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. How's that for a sync clap for you? For the joke, we're gonna throw the gray card up. Just so that way it's there and it's a little bit of a flex because I have one, you know, because they cost like $6 on Amazon and not everybody has a gray card. So that's me. All right.